dentro de uma programação do IEAT, né, que é o Instituto de Estudos Avançados Transdisciplinares da UFMG, e o professor Klaus é professor emérito de literatura comparada da Universidade de Indiana, em Bloomington, onde ele ministrou disciplinas em estudos interartes e trabalhou nesse tema em sua pesquisa em intermediáticos, teoria literária e de literatura em línguas europeias do século XIX e XX. Ele vai estar conosco aqui de 7 de abril até 14 de maio, acabou de dar um curso lá na Belas Artes, e nós aqui na mesa tem o professor Eduardo também, que é diretor lá, Cristiano, onde é que eu tirei Eduardo? Professor recém-empossado lá na Belas Artes, e a professora Maria do Carmo Veneroso, da Cacau, né, que foi quem nos deu a oportunidade de trazer o professor Klaus aqui. Então, eu vou passar a palavra para os dois, para ver se eles têm alguma coisa a acrescentar, e a gente dá início rapidinho aqui à apresentação.
Muito obrigado. Boa tarde a todos e todas, ao professor Klaus Kluwer, ao professor Estevam e a professora Maria do Carmo Veneroso, e a todos e todas presentes. Queria falar brevemente sobre a nossa alegria de poder estar nesse encontro, de participar mais uma vez junto ao IEAT, de afirmar essa presença das relações transdisciplinares da arte com a ciência, com a cultura, com todas as formas de fazeres e saberes que compõem a nossa relação com a construção e a produção do conhecimento. Como o professor Estevam acabou de me apresentar, eu sou o novo diretor da Escola de Belas Artes, uma escola que completa seus 60 anos também, agora nesse mês completou os 60 anos agora em abril, e esses dois eventos, né, a passagem do tempo da escola e a renovação da sua direção, marcam uma questão que é muito importante para a nossa escola e para a universidade, que são os processos, os ciclos de tempo, a relação passado, presente e futuro, e como que nós nos situamos nessa passagem e nessas temporalidades que demarcam o nosso estar aqui, o que temos como desafios desse nosso tempo, desse momento que vivemos, especialmente um momento de acirradas crises políticas e institucionais, e as nossas formas de sobrevivência e resistência, e especialmente a arte, afirmando a sua renovação e o seu papel de constante renovação e ressignificação da sua existência, que, no nosso caso, pela Escola de Belas Artes, já perdura por 6 décadas nessa universidade, que também completa esse ano seus 90 anos. Ficamos muito felizes de estar nesse encontro e poder colocar também uma afirmação no sentido da internacionalização da Escola de Belas Artes, das suas relações de produção, que perpassam as dimensões locais e também as dimensões que ultrapassam os nossos territórios e nos colocam em trânsito em relação com o mundo e com a produção contemporânea. Agradeço especialmente ao professor Klaus Kluwer, que pôde nos trazer e manter ativa essa troca de conhecimentos e de saberes entre as universidades, entre a UFMG e todos que partilham conosco da busca pelo aperfeiçoamento, pela contínua transformação dos nossos conhecimentos. Obrigado, professora Maria do Carmo Veneroso, pela iniciativa, pelo empenho e pelo esforço em avançar com a produção e especialmente nesse momento com a difusão dos conhecimentos artísticos em interdisciplinaridade, em transdisciplinaridade com várias facetas dos saberes na universidade. Muito obrigado a todos e a todas.
Boa tarde a todos. Eu queria agradecer, né, ao Estevam, ao IEAT, a todos os funcionários do IEAT que estão colaborando muito, né, nessa estádio de Claus, e principalmente pela possibilidade que o IEAT está, né, promovendo esse tipo de interação que a gente está tendo com professores como o Claus, que é uma figura, né, internacionalmente conhecida, é uma referência, né, nessa área de individualidade, e é um grande prazer a gente ter aqui de novo. Então, assim, é uma pessoa que acho que está de acordo com a política, né, da IEAT, que realmente transita, né, entre várias áreas, várias mídias, com muita inteligência, e é por isso que a gente pensou, né, na possibilidade de ele vir com essa carta, e deu um curso na escola, terminou agora, e a gente está aqui também, né, está presente aqui o grupo intermídio, né, que foi fundado pela Thaís Flores e com a participação do Claus, então é sempre, né, faz um prazer a gente recebê-lo aqui de volta para ter essa troca, né, que sempre é muito produtiva. Então, quero agradecer o Estevam, o Claus, né, essa possibilidade de a gente ter você aqui de novo, viu? É sempre um grande prazer, né? E agradecer ao Cristiano também a presença dele aqui e o apoio, né? Que está sendo muito importante. Tentando fazer com a pessoa também, tá?
Mas o meu tema já está cada vez, making it new, intermediality and current theories of adaptation. Make it new, the American poet Ezra Pound used to admonish aspiring poets who wanted to be at the forefront as inventors. His admonitions were realized in the 1950s by three young poets of São Paulo, Décio Pinhatari and Haroldo and Augusto de Campos, who published their work privately under the label Edições Invenção, as inventors, and were nicknamed Os Paulistas. In 1957, Haroldo created this poem. 1957. In the same year, I arrived from Germany at Indiana University in Bloomington to take over teaching a newly designed course called Modern Literature and the Arts. It was based on the concept of the mutual illumination of the arts and showed parallels between works and periods and movements ranging from the late 18th century to the early 20th that were actually dealt with in entirely separate academic departments. Poems and short literary narratives, orchestral music, and painting. It also dealt with film, which at that time had no academic home at all. Had I seen Haroldo's poem in 1957, I would not have known how to deal with it. In fact, in 1958, I did see in a journal a text presented as a poem by Eugen Gomringer that left me entirely baffled. It was to take another 10 years before I learned how to deal with concrete poetry, a label arranged upon by the Swiss-Bolivian Gomringer and the three Brazilians. I began to understand the importance of each aspect of the verbal material and of the placement of each text element on the page. I saw that in Branco, traditional syntax had been replaced by a spatial syntax, which semanticized the white on the page, where the words branco and vermelho referred to colors, and the heavy black of the letters visually supplied another, while the color named by the black branco visually emerged in the opening created by the horizontal line and the diagonally descending lines. The inseparable fusion of verbal and visual elements made it into what I later learned to call an intermediate text. Sorry, I should have got that further. Here's the poem again, and I also felt that unless it was entirely self-referential, the poem referred to a non-figurative painting. And all the later confirmed my suspicion that I now find it both challenging and illuminating to read it as a kind of transcreation of Kazimir Malevich's 1915 painting Black Square and Red Square. As such, it falls into the time-honored genre of ekphrastic poetry, still considered one of the principal forms of word and image relations. I have related elsewhere how the pioneering studies of the interrelations of literature with music and the visual arts that appeared around mid-century, primarily in the United States, resulted in the kind of course I was invited to teach in 1957 and have developed further over the past 60 years, and how this gradually changed into a field of research and teaching that now has a home in different departments and schools, and in a few instances now even it has its own independent study centers. I have shown in several essays how the field has in many instances moved away from centering on literature and its inter-arts relations, and even from the focus on what is still considered in general discourse the arts. I have also described how this interdisciplinary field redefined itself some 30 years ago as the study of intermediality or intermediate studies, and found itself in a fruitful but at times strained relationship with the older media studies, which may have been more of one of the reasons why intermediate scholars began to develop carefully designed but often conflicting theories of mediality and intermediality, and more recently, transmediality. Many of these theories were designed by German scholars, but have been absorbed and further developed in English-speaking countries and in Scandinavia. The past 10 years have been marked by innovative thinking and approaches that have challenged and to some extent changed the constructions of earlier theorists. 2 newly published handbooks and 2 individual studies will provide the basis for my observations on significant aspects on the current situation in the German and English-speaking discourse on intermediality. The Handbook of Intermediality, Literature, Image, Sound, Music, edited by Gabriele Rippel and published in 2015, is the first volume in the Greuter series of Handbooks of English and American Studies, and is programmatically restricted to investigating the relations of literary texts written in English to other media, but draws on its bibliographic resources on theoretical texts written in English and in German. The 34 essays by recognized specialists in the field have been divided into 3 large categories: text and image, 23 essays, music, sound, and performance, 8 essays, and intermediate methodology and intersectionalities, 3 essays. This structure and the choice of topics was supposedly decided by the editor, whose introduction provides the general theoretical orientation for the enterprise. Interestingly, the first category on literature and, what is it called? Text and image. The first category begins with 7 essays grouped under the heading ekphrasis. This is one intermediate category that has been receiving renewed attention as exemplifying a form of media transformation, or in an older terminology, intermediate transposition. Another category, adaptation, traditionally represented by an extensive discourse on filmic or cinematographic adaptations of literary texts, is dealt with in an essay by Barbara Strohmann, Adaptation, Remediation, Transmediality. As we shall see, the combination of these three keywords is characteristic of more recent approaches to the concept of adaptation. The variety of contemporary approaches is displayed in the Oxford Handbook of Adaptation Studies, edited by Thomas Leach, which has just been published in March. Larger than Ripple's handbook, it has also been designed and organized by its editor. Many of its 40 contributions also involve the verbal medium and quite a few aspects of cinema. A major difference expressed in the title is an emphasis on the approaches taken by scholars to a large and many-faceted phenomenon that involves many different media and very frequently the crossing of media boundaries. The 7 parts into which it is divided avoid imposing a theoretical framework or a classificatory grid over the objects of these studies and over the studies themselves. The foundations of adaptation study are laid out in this initial 6 essays, beginning with Timothy Corrigan's Defining Adaptation. Corrigan reminds us that historically, processes of adaptation have been practiced, analyzed, and theorized in sociological and scientific contexts, with the Darwinian scheme the most outstanding example, as mythological and theological activities, and as textual and representational movements, with an examination of the latter occupying most of the rest of the essay. Of the long list of strategies employed in, quote, linguistic, visual, or audio adaptations that he cites and then explains, adaptation as quotation, as allusion, as embedding, as appropriation, and as palimpsest. The objectives of my own reflections are especially well served by Corrigan's remark that, quote, postmodern strategies of pastiche, bricolage, and collage dramatically shaped and reassembled fragments as increasingly ubiquitous activities, which cast an ironic sheen on the way these adaptations may have resulted in making it new. One relatively new facet of adaptation studies highlighted by Corrigan is the addition of a third perspective to our understanding of adaptation, besides considering it as process and a product. It concerns the receiver's adjustment of the horizons of expectations and the habits and abilities to receive media products when these are presented in unconventional or entirely new forms or media. Adapting to the demands of viewing films was one such adjustment. Such demands on readjusting one's expectations and habits and overcoming conventional ideological or moral resistance have, of course, always accompanied the development of the production and mediation of configurations, not only in all the arts as we have been accustomed to view them collectively since the 18th century, but also products with utilitarian and entirely non-artistic functions. This may have been entirely a question of content, a content of subject matter. I guess you recognize the title. This is The Painting. In 1849, viewers of Gustave Courbet's Os Quebradores de Pedras, the Stonebreakers, Casseurs de Pierre, is the French title, had great difficulty to accept the depiction of anonymous lower-class individuals at their place of work, a topic at best suited to some form of genre painting on a canvas measuring 165 by 257 centimeters a size conventionally reserved for serious subjects, such as historical, mythological, or religious representations. The adjustment to new media and media of representation, new modes and media of representation viewers had to make around the turn of the century were much more profound. The relation of Cubist paintings to the subject announced in their titles became more and more tenuous. Yeah, not such a good reproduction. Viewers of Pablo Picasso's Majoli found the words stenciled into the painting not only supposedly referring to its unrecognizable subject, but also to a popular tune. And the reference to music was reinforced by the key signature at the beginning of a musical staff going to the left, inscribed close to the title. Can you see that? Is that better? So you see Majoli, and then a little bit to the right and up, there is a musical. It's just music. So there's all of a sudden music in the painting, expressed by several means. A few months later, Picasso pasted a piece of oilcloth imprinted with the illusionistic rendition of chair caning onto part of an oval canvas and covered the rest of the canvas with forms developed in earlier Cubist still lifes and suggesting objects on the table. He then put a piece of rope instead of a frame around the oval shape. The adaptation expected of the viewer was extraordinary. It meant accepting a collage of disparate material which until then was incompatible with any physical media admissible in still life painting or in any kind of pictorial representation as a work of art. Without forgetting for a moment that what we see is really an image of a utilitarian object decorating another utilitarian object, a ready-made. It meant attaching to the image of chair caning a meaning that could compete or interact with the meaning conveyed by the painted parts of the image. Perhaps it suggested that the technologically produced illusionistic reproduction of the image presented by an object of daily life might be accepted by many viewers more readily as a way to represent reality than the Cubist forms in the rest of the picture. Perhaps it was part of the game. The letters Jou, painted above, may be read to represent a journal, a newspaper lying on the table. But it may also be read as suggesting other words beginning with these letters, such as jouer, play, which would self-referentially indicate the playfulness and the surprise effect of this proceeding. Five years later, exhibition goers in New York would have had to adapt to Picasso's gesture of gluing a ready-made object into a work of art when presented by an even more radical gesture. They would have had to confront the claim to be exhibited alongside other sculptures by a urinal lying on its back and signed, dated, and given a rather ironic title, Fountain. Marcel Duchamp's entry for the 1917 exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in New York was rejected. The object was photographed by Alfred Stieglitz and then apparently destroyed. But viewers caught on to the idea of the ready-made. Fountain, as an image, and then in a 1968 reproduction that I am showing, became the most discussed visual art object of the 20th century. What disturbed readers and required the greatest adaptation regarding viewing habits was the incompatibility of the original function of these ready-mades with any established sense of the nature and function of art as understood 100 years ago. It was also the material incompatibility of these objects and the manner of the production by means of technological processes. In receiving musical compositions, developing technologies would require a listener's greatest effort of adapting to new challenges, although at the beginning of last century, the challenge came entirely from within, quite analogous to what viewers were expected to adjust to when confronted with Black Square and Red Square by Malevich. Atonal music and music based on the 12-tone series were entirely composed for conventional instruments. A composition exclusively for percussion instruments, with the addition of a few unusual ones, like Edgar Varèse's Ionisation, effective in its exploitations of rhythms and timbres, may still leave a listener with difficulties in managing his expectations, including the sense of what is a pause and what is the end of the work. But, without going into details, I'd suggest that the greatest challenge came with the exploitation, also for serious music, of increasingly new devices for sound recording and ultimately sound production. Many of these inventions were made for the mass media, radio, the cinema, and then television, where they were more easily accepted, especially because the music that's recorded followed more conventional paths. But in the creation of serious music for much smaller audiences, these new technologies were mostly used for experimental efforts, which expected the listener to become familiar with unconventional and unfamiliar sounds and musical structures. Reminiscent of the visual ready-made was the musique concrète, developed in the 40s by Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry and taken up by others. Schaeffer used available recording devices to catch instances of everyday noises, such as the sounds made by trains starting or passing by or crossing bridges. He would then cut up these recorded pieces and recombine them so that, in the case of his Études chemin de fer, railway study, the succession of noises would not allow listeners to reconstruct the train line. But if they concentrated on the rhythmic, dynamic, and thermal qualities of the sounds, their density, and the structuring of the sequences of montaged elements, they would be able to receive this composition as music without ever becoming oblivious to the material sources of the sounds. There is no point in considering here the adaptation of listening habits and expectations to the production of new music during the many further stages of technological developments, which have so far ended up with the simultaneous creation of music and non-figurative images by computer programs that are now studied, as I just found out, under the label visual music. The latter obviously requires the ability to simultaneously process visual and sonorous information, as well as the interaction of both, most likely with music being reduced in the reception to a supporting role. One aspect that stands out in the adjustments audiences have had to make to the profound changes in the production of new kinds of works and all the arts is the importance of the materiality of these products. This is not only true of the reception of new and possibly experimental works, but is also a consideration that has moved to the forefront in analyzing and theorizing about media and their interrelations. The move to creating the label Studies of Intermediality was in part motivated by a new understanding of the role of the materiality in establishing the basic mechanics of and modalities of any medium, regardless of the function and ideological charge of any specific medial configuration. It was my realization that concrete poetry was deeply concerned with exploring the possibilities inherent in the verbal material, including its visual and spatial aspects, that ultimately made me understand how to read these poems. The choice of a sans serif font was important for Branco as well as for Ping Pong, and so was the exact placement of the words on the page. They followed a spatial syntax invented for each text. The placement of the 2 lines of 3 instances of the near identical 4-letter words between a ping pong on the upper left and another on the lower right results in an application of the rule of the affinity of forms in reading the poem. We connect the 2 single ping pongs, and in so doing, mentally jump across the 2 lines in the center, which, because of the verbal semantics, are seen to constitute a net for a game of verbal ping pong. Once we have become aware of this, we see the affinity of forms also at play at each of the 2 central lines and even vertically. Gomringer had written his poem as an attempt to transfer certain characteristics of the concrete art practiced by painters around Max Bill and Zurich and by the Bauhaus artist Joseph Albers. Similarly, the Brazilians were engaged in adapting what they considered the most prominent traits in the work, not only of the earlier avant-garde poets, but also of painters like Piet Mondrian, Albers, and Bill, and the composer Anton van Leeuwen, in their project to make it new. It was the emphasis on the material aspects of the work of these models and of the exploitation to the fullest of a highly reduced musical or visual material, carefully organized to communicate ideas inherent in its structure that the poets applied in their texts, where the particular arrangement of a highly reduced verbal material supported the semantic charge of the words employed. The semantics of the seemingly self-contained Branco let me read it as a transposition of a non-figurative visual word with materials reduced to these 3 colors. The Malevich painting allows us to detect so many characteristics that are analogous to Aroldo's text, including the absence of an expressed or implied I, you, communicating a subjective message, not there. That the poem can be read not only as an ekphrastic transposition of the painting, but also as a full-fledged intermediate translation. For the just published Oxford Handbook, I wrote an essay on ekphrasis and adaptation that I have modified since I drafted it 4 years ago. In keeping with the theories of intermediality widely accepted at the time, especially the scheme proposed by Irina Rajewski for humanities studies, I then agreed to consider ekphrasis as the result of an intermediate transposition that ended up as a purely verbal text, which referred in a number of ways to the visual configuration it had transposed. Consequently, I propose to think of ekphrasis in a condensed definition as, quote, the verbal representation of real or fictive configurations composed in a non-kinetic visual medium. Ignorant about the approaches taken in other essays written for the volume, I retained the definition of adaptation I had written in 1992. Quote, the term seems best used to cover the process and its results of adjusting a specific source text to the requirements and possibilities of another medium in such a way that parts of it are retained and incorporated in the resultant new text or medial configuration. I added that I would now enlarge this formulation to include the adaptation of genres, the imitation in a different medium of formal features or compositional strategies employed in specific configurations, as well as the idea of intra-medial adaptation. The idea that adaptations would retain parts of the source while ekphrastic texts would not led me now to formulate a view that in this way I had not entertained before. Quote, it is best to think of the shared and transposed elements, such as plot, action, characters, and settings, as transmedial elements, realized and shaped according to the possibilities and limitations of each medium and its constituent medium, according to or subverting contemporary aesthetic conventions, and often with changed thematic or ideological orientations. Fidelity to the source text can be concern motivating the adapting team, but it is not a critical consideration. For the critic, changes and transformations should be of equal, if not greater, interest. But each of these elements can be subject to change and transformation. Depending on the degree and nature of such changes, we may conceive of the new configuration as based on, and finally, inspired by, rather than adapted from. This distinction may apply especially to transpositions of verbal narratives to a medium such as the dance, which substitutes an entirely different sign system in order to denote, very roughly speaking, the same object. Interestingly, I found what looked like the same idea expressed in the very title of a book by Lars Elliston, published in 2014 after I had finished my essay. The title is Media Transformation, the Transfer of Media Characteristics Among Media. What I had labeled transmedial elements seemed to appear in Elliston's extensive treatise as media characteristics. But this may be a misapprehension based on a different understanding of the concept of medium, as either of us constructs it. My problem is, frankly, that I still cannot find his model very intelligible, even though a good deal of it overlaps with mine. An even more recent book, Jürgen Bruhn's The Intermediality of Narrative Literature, Medialities Matter, published in 2016, sheds some light on Elliston's model, which Bruhn tends to support, but there still seems to be some fundamental disagreement with my construction of the concept medium. Bruhn approvingly cites the broad definition offered in 1988 by Bohn, Müller, and Ruppert, as I have cited it several times, last in 2007. Quote, that which mediates for and between humans a meaningful sign or combination of signs with the aid of suitable transmitters across temporal and or spatial distances. Here I added a Portuguese translation of it. It's a rather widely accepted, still, after so many years, rather widely accepted, basic idea of what is a medium. We both, Bruhn and I, agree that this includes the role of a sender and the role of a receiver. And Bruhn is certainly correct in stating that the media product, as the repository and transmitter of the sender's meaningful signs, may be interpreted differently by the receiver, so that the original form and content may be transformed in the transfer process. There is also general agreement that we do not have direct access to a medium, only to its products, that we construct our concept of that medium by generalizing from the contact with media products, and that it would be wrong to conceive of a pure medium, because according to W.J.K. Mitchell's phrase, all media are mixed media. And as I have repeatedly stated, intertextuality always also implies intermediality, which applies to all configurations in any medium. While there may be differences in the attempts to define medium, which at this moment I do not want to explore or reconcile, there seems to be full agreement on the tenability and usefulness of a term that has moved to the foreground in many recent discussions of intermediality, the concept and term transmediality. Both terms, intermediality and transmediality, are based on the assumed existence of borders designating each medium, and on the idea that these borders are crossed or even eliminated in intermediate processes such as media combination or change of media, of which adaptation is an exemplary instance. But while it has long been noticed that certain terms recur in discussions and analyses of configurations in several, if not all, media, such as rhythm, perspective, color, and frame, they do not necessarily designate the same when applied to specific media. A list of terms used across media borders or transmedially is much longer and includes terms designating content, form, style, compositional strategies, and critical concepts, as, for example, portrait, irony, parody, allegory, structure, collage, montage, and implied author or implied reader, viewer, listener. The list is much longer, but recently much attention has been paid to terms like representation, narrativity, and of course, adaptation. Here, and especially in connection with these last three terms, we also encounter what I labeled transmedial elements that can be transposed in the process of adaptation. Character, plot, story setting, and more. Elements that are most prominent in a cinematographic adaptation of a verbal narrative or in novelizations of films. But structural elements can also have an important role, as in the musicalization of fiction or of painting, as well as in so-called filmic writing, the adaptation of cinematographic strategies to verbal narratives. Collage and montage were techniques first developed in visual media and then adapted to the possibilities and limitations of poetry, fiction, and musical composition. But as the essays by Straumann in the Handbook of Intermediality and by Corrigan and the Oxford Handbook of Adaptation Studies show, the adaptation of verbal narratives to the medium of film remains the most discussed instance, and, as Corrigan elaborates, also the one where critical and theoretical discourse has undergone the most profound developments. Even the dust jacket demonstrates this. The image is entirely enigmatic for the non-initiated, like myself. I looked at it and I didn't know what to make. Why is this thing supposed to illustrate adaptation? But of course, it was right there, because it is immediately recognizable for those who have seen it as a still from the 2002 film adaptation, which, according to Corrigan, exemplifies many of the possibilities implied by the term. You just have to know the film. An older film that I once carefully analyzed and still find most instructive as the fascinating and critical instance of a multiple adaptation is Nelson Pereira dos Santos' Como Era Gostoso Meu Francês of 1970, whose very title indicates that things did not go quite so well as they did for Hans Staden, whose 16th century accounts serve as the film's principal source. Okay, this is on the left. You see the title of the 1557 book by Hans Staden, very nicely. Calligraphy is even, wahrhaftige Historia und Beschreibung einer Landschaft der wilden, nackten, grimmigen Menschfresserleuten in der neuen Welt Amerika gelegen, and so forth. So all of this, and then at the bottom you have, first of all, a woodcut showing Staden swinging in a hammer, and underneath you have the date 1557. On the right, I simply added the cover page, or the title rather, of a recent edition of the two reports by Staden, with an illustration that I don't understand. I don't know what this girl is doing here, but that's not important. All right. This included, Staden, whose true 16th century account served as the film's principal source. This included the second set of contemporary illustrations, that is 16th century illustrations, made for Staden's first text. There are images in the film that follow almost precisely these visual models, well known in Brazil. And you can say, I don't have to, you all can see how really the film used the model, except that the male French, here in this case French male, is still wearing pants. He will soon take off his pants and be as naked as all the other Indians. But otherwise, it's really, the film follows the model of the images. And I could have shown many instances of this. There are images in the film that follow almost precisely these visual models well known in Brazil. In fact, for long stretches, the film pretends to be an anachronistic documentary transposition of the supposedly accurate anthropological source as which Staden's reports have been received. Even the languages are only to be in French, with subtitles in Portuguese. French because Hans has become Jean, a Frenchman captured along with Portuguese, and therefore food for consumption, because he is betrayed by a compatriot, afraid to lose his trading privileges with Jean's captains. In other words, the Frenchman doesn't allow others to know that the captain is really French. So Jean is a Portuguese. But Jean kills his betrayer in a fight over gold coins, worthless for the Indians. He is finally ritually killed by his captors, who had given him a wife who was awarded his neck after the death. And you see on the left the couple happily walking along. They got along very nicely. And then after he was killed, they had already told her, you get the neck. And she's chewing on the right. She's chewing on the neck. Yeah. This happens after a train of events that makes Jean more and more into a symbolic figure of the colonizers, with increasing reminders of the importance of the Manifesto Antropofágico, with the naked Indians portrayed by made-up contemporary Brazilians, who in the end are shown to be just that, and a close-up of faces indicating the range of races making up the population. I don't have a still of that. All I can show you is a picture here of Jean, of course, the Frenchman, and the chieftain of the Indians, and then his wife behind her. The chieftain was a professor of medicine in, I forget which place, but I mean, you can see, ultimately, all of these Indians are shown to be all kinds of people, but not really Indians. So the film moves away from its totally anthropological, pseudo-anthropological orientation. And from the beginning, the entire anthropological enterprise is undercut by the reading of French period documents, texts read in the voice of a well-known radio announcers, which are shown to be totally mendacious by the visual images of the actual events. So from the beginning, you said that what you see, supposedly documentary, is totally the opposite of what the French write about these naked savages. There is a fascinating play with questions of fidelity to the source texts here, for a long time a major concern of these kinds of adaptation studies. Corrigan offers an overview that highlights Robert Stamm's role in moving these studies away from concerns with fidelity into the fields of intertextuality and transtextuality, where the key terms are translation, transposition, and transformation. Corrigan concludes that, quote, Stamm's argument situates adaptation in historical and cultural fields that invariably call attention to the social and ideological implications of any adaptation. In summing up his overview over revaluations and expansions, Corrigan points out that recent trends in adaptation studies emphatically underline how adaptation can be found throughout our culture in a wide variety of fields far beyond the arts. But even within the fields covered by studies of intermediality, the focus is considerably widened, not only in ways that approach adaptation under such different terms as rewriting, appropriation or partition, with the difference in perspective implied in these terms. But on the one hand, by looking at the institutional side of the so-called adaptation industry, and in most innovative development in adaptations involving digital media, often with possibilities for readers' responses and several forms of interactivity. Corrigan mentions fan fiction. An MA thesis recently defended here at the UFMG by Clara Mateus Nogueira analyzed very intelligently two transpositions of plays by Shakespeare to two different social media undertaken by the Royal Shakespeare Company, where the connection of the source text appeared to be so tenuous that it was unclear that they could be called adaptations, but where the reception on several platforms of transmedial elements by thousands of participants and their expressed reaction constituted new forms of transformation and distribution that are apparently becoming more and more common. I have no space here to explore the related but still quite different concept of remediation. I gave two versions. Michael Curtis, remediation, others like to say remediation. That concept has likewise attracted considerable critical attention since the term was launched by David Bolter and Richard Grusin in 1999. Let me only point out that these processes have enabled the survival in altered form of many media products, including those of an ephemeral nature or those that have been destroyed. Many graffiti that have been painted over have been preserved in photos. And so has Courbet's Stonebreakers, destroyed by bombs in Dresden in 1945. But looking for it on Google presents us with rather different versions, remediations of one or several original photos, which were, of course, also remediations. And just briefly, I just copied. This is the painting. This is also the painting, and this is the painting. I mean, you can see you're not really seeing the same image. Okay. But the work has been rewritten in a totally different technique, a large-size collage of fragments from photographic magazines depicting 20th century materials, which Vic Moniz then photographed and framed as a depict, and what may be the same size as a lost original Courbet painting. This work is a striking example of what Corrigan referred to as the postmodern strategies of pastiche, bricolage, and collage. And while it is an adaptation and no remediation, Munich thinks of it as preserving the lost original in its own way. At least that's what he told me. Here it is. It's huge. And here is a detail of it where you can see. I mean, the collage is modern material. See, these stone breakers are no longer breaking stones, but are working. I mean, they're made up of materials that are 20th century materials, and yet the whole thing seems to preserve the originally, the lost, destroyed original. Now we are nearing the end. If the ever-widening range of the concepts and practices of adaptation and their study has made adaptation indeed the prime example of media transformation, the other oft-cited example, ekphrasis, may have moved farther away from its traditional position as a result of rethinking the concept without changing a letter in the poems or narrative passages that we label ekphrastic. The catchy definition of ekphrasis as, quote, the verbal representation of a visual representation, although still at the center of the essay ekphrasis theory, in Ribbon's handbook has long been questioned, certainly by me. But instead of looking at such texts as transpositions of configurations in the visual medium, usually of their representational content, recent studies have emphasized their status as records of an encounter of a viewer or gazer with a painting or a sculpture. This record may often refer to aspects of details found, or details found also by readers of the text in the work of works contemplated. But as I have shown in recent studies, such direct references need not necessarily be found in the text, whether the object contemplated is a representation of objects in the phenomenal world or a non-figurative painting, such as Malevich's Black Square and Red Square. However, I have earlier declared Aurorus Branco to be a translation or transcreation of Malevich's painting. And I insist on considering the poem to be not only an intermediate or intersemiotic transposition, terms I have used in earlier essays, but indeed a translation. As such, it is of course also the product of a contemplative encounter with the painting. But to decide to read the poem as a translation, which is the reader's decision, to determine what might be the equivalence, what the transformations, what the gains and the losses, and especially what the interpretation manifests in the expressed in translation. As I stated before, the precondition for such a reading is that the voice of the text can also be heard as the implied voice of the painting's creator. In this particular case, it is the absence of such implied voices and any manifest subjectivity in both works that allows this approach. Ekphrasis of the new approaches to the subject covers a wide range, as is demonstrated clearly in David Kennedy's contribution to Ripple's handbook, the essay Ekphrasis in Poetry. While on one hand it may still be perceived as an instance of intermediate transposition resulting in a text in a single medium but referring in various ways to its visual source or sources, on the other it appears as a record of an encounter or engagement with paintings, sculptures, or even bridges or cathedrals that may not convey much of a sense of an intermediate transfer at all. Adaptations, in all the many forms it has assumed and the many media it involves, has for the most part retained its connection with the source text. I do not know whether Ezra Pound would think of them as making anew, and you would probably not consider them to be inventions. In fact, it may be more appropriate to think of them as actos anthropophagicos, with at times surprising results. Thank you.